Chapter 2. Name, please. Mrs. Merriam's announcement was followed by a long, embarrassing pause. Mr. Drew did not feel that he should urge a new client to go on with the case if she did not wish to. Nancy, Bess, and George looked down at the floor, not knowing what to say. Their caller must have realized that her remark had stunned the others. She said quickly, "Please don't think I believe you're incapable of handling this matter. I just don't want anybody to get hurt." Everyone looked at her and smiled. Mr. Drew said, "We're used to this sort of thing, Mrs. Merriam. Don't worry about us. However, I don't want anything to happen to you. You said your husband is away a great deal. I'd advise you not to stay in your house alone." Nancy added, "And please spend tonight with us, Mrs. Merriam." The woman smiled gratefully. "You are very kind people. I admit I am a little afraid to go back to Waterford this late. It's a fairly long trip by plane, and then I have to drive to my house." Mr. Drew said, "Indeed, you must stay." The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Mr. Drew answered and was told that the police were calling. Chief McGinnis, a longtime friend of the Drews, came on the line. He said, "That man who escaped from your home by the front door has not been apprehended. However, we caught that burly fellow who barged in your back door. He refuses to give his name and claims he is innocent." The chief chuckled. "He had the nerve to say that Mrs. Gruen had attacked him." "How did he explain the mask?" the lawyer asked. "He didn't. We're checking the fingerprints on both masks." Mr. Drew reported the conversation to the others. "I imagine the police will keep the fellow in jail until he's willing to cooperate. And now I have a surprise to tell all of you. I know Mrs. Merriam is in a hurry to have this mystery solved. Unfortunately, I am busy on another case which will take me out of town for a while. If you're willing, Mrs. Merriam, I should like Nancy, Bess, and George to go to Waterford without me and stay at your yacht club. I can highly recommend my daughter as an amateur sleuth." Hannah Gruen spoke up. "Nancy has a long list of accomplishments, and Bess and George have been a wonderful help to her. She discovered the secret of the old clock and recently solved the mystery of the ivory charm." Mrs. Merriam's face broke into a wide smile. "I shall be delighted to work with them. But as I said before, I don't want anyone getting hurt. If you girls promise not to take any chances, I'll say yes." At once Bess said, "I promise." George added that she would see to it that Nancy took no unnecessary chances. Mr. Drew said he had a request of his own. "Nancy, I want you to use a disguise and an assumed name while you're working on this case." Again Mrs. Merriam looked alarmed. "Is that necessary? Won't it bring more trouble to Nancy?" The lawyer shook his head. "It should be good protection." Bess asked, "How did the person on the phone and the two attackers know Mrs. Merriam is here?" Suddenly the woman put a hand over her mouth and fear came into her eyes. "I'm afraid," she said slowly, "that a friend of mine might have given the whole thing away. I thought she could be trusted to keep a secret. She told me she had been down to Mr. Basswood's art store. She is a great talker, and I'm afraid may have mentioned my plans." Mr. Drew frowned. "That is unfortunate," he said. "I shall not be working on the case, however, so if they follow me, they will learn nothing. But if they think Nancy is coming to Waterford, that's a very good reason why she should assume a disguise." Bess remarked that it was lucky the man who had seen her in the kitchen was in jail. The one in the front hall had not had a glimpse of any of the girls. There was a slight lull in the conversation as each one in the group thought about the case. The silence was broken by George. With a broad grin, she asked, "Let's work on a new name for Nancy. Since it's a mystery about books, how about Libby for library?" "Booker?" The others laughed. Bess's eyes began to twinkle. "Mr. Basswood's name is partly fish. How about Nancy calling herself Carrie Fisher?" Again there was laughter and many suggestions followed. In the end, it was Hannah Gruen who proposed a name which appealed to Nancy. Smiling, Nancy said, "From now on, will everyone please address me as Miss Debbie Lynbrook?" "Okay, Debbie," said Bess and George together. Bess added, "I just hope we don't make any mistakes and call you by your own name." Nancy chuckled. "If you do, I won't pay any attention to you." Mr. Drew said that he would get in touch with Mr. Ayer. the manager of the yacht club, and tell him what the plan was. He would request that all messages for Nancy Drew be rerouted to Mr. Ayer. The only one Nancy was to take were those under the name of Debbie Lynbrook. The light turn in the conversation had revived Mrs. Merriam's spirits. Hannah suggested that they now eat her raspberry shortcake. Everyone returned to the table and sat down. Bess said, "Mrs. Merriam, Nancy hinted that you know something about a whispering statue. Will you tell us the story?" "I'll be glad to," she replied. With a smile, she added, "It concerns the yacht club. Maybe you three girls would like to solve that mystery too." Mrs. Merriam said that the statue was life-size and of fine Italian marble. It had been imported from Italy many years before by a man who was of Italian descent. He lived in the mansion, which is now the Waterford Yacht Club. The statue stood on the front lawn. Suddenly Mrs. Merriam stared at Nancy. "You know, as I recall the face of the sculpture, the young woman looked very much like you. Actually, she was supposed to resemble the wife of its owner. The couple had come from Italy, but she never got over a feeling of homesickness. She passed away while still in her 20s. "How sad," Bess murmured softly. Mrs. Merriam said she had never known the woman, but had met the husband a few times. He was a very nice man. He died suddenly, and it took a long time to settle the estate. In the meantime, the yacht club decided to purchase the place. Nancy asked, "Was the statue there at that time?" "Oh, yes. It was stolen between the time the contract was signed and the day the yacht club took title to the property. The theft was reported to the police. Though they made a careful investigation, no clues were ever found." "I should think," said George, "that if the statue whispered, tracing it would be easy." Hannah Gruen suggested that perhaps the marble figure had been taken away by boat and shipped out of the country. "That's possible," said Mr. Drew. "Well, you girls are going to have a busy time at Waterford." He asked Mrs. Merriam if she had ever heard the statue whisper. "Indeed, I did. It was kind of weird. Sometimes you could almost distinguish words. There were warnings and then affectionate little murmurings. By the time the raspberry shortcake had been eaten, Bess and George said they really should return home. Mr. Drew offered to drive them there. After they had gone, Hannah and Nancy took Mrs. Merriam to the second floor. As they led her into the guest room, she again remarked how kind they all were. "I can never thank you enough," she said as Hannah pulled out a bureau drawer and showed her where there was a nightgown, robe, and slippers. Nancy said good night and left the room. Instead of going to her own bedroom, she went back downstairs. She called her little terrier Togo from his special place in the basement. He was an affectionate animal, and the Drews had made it a rule that whenever they had guests, he would have to stay downstairs. Nancy sat down in a comfortable upholstered chair in the living room, and he jumped into her lap. As Nancy fondled her pet and waited for her father's return, she thought about the two mysteries at Waterford. "It's going to be a real challenge," she decided. "I'll wear a full wig, which will cover part of my face, and I'll use some quick tanning lotion to darken my skin." Mrs. Gruen came downstairs and said she wondered why Mr. Drew had not come back. "It doesn't take this long to get to Bess and George's homes." Nancy glanced at her watch and was alarmed to see that it was nearly midnight. Had something happened to her father? End of chapter 2.